The following program contains the opinions of the host, guests, and call-in participants. These do not necessarily represent the views of this show's distributors or sponsors. This program may contain obscene, profane, or otherwise objectionable language. Viewer discretion is advised. Yes, coming to you cordless, everybody. It's Thursday night, March 6th, 2025. It's 9 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States, 6 p.m. on the West Coast, 8 a.m. in Singapore, 12 noon in Sydney, Australia, and here where I'm sitting in Northeast Minneapolis, it's 8 p.m. Central Time, starting next Monday, Central Daylight Time, but not today. I'm Jim Peters. Welcome to another edition of Jim Peters at Night. This is episode number 205, if you're keeping score at home. Our guest tonight is Nathan Worcester. He's a correspondent for the Epoch Times. He's been on the show before. He's a wonderful man. I'm looking forward to talking to him. Got a couple announcements here. Tomorrow night, we're doing a Friday show tomorrow night. We don't usually do that, but we are because Lee Richardson is coming on. She's the founder of the Brain Performance Center in Dallas, and we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of psychological issues, and you know I have them. So why should I go to a therapist when I can have Lee on the show, you know? No, we're talking about a couple things. We're going to be talking about sports gambling addiction in America, and we're also going to be talking about loneliness, believe it or not, because there's a whole bunch of people in America that are lonely, and I'm convinced this is killing the republic, and I'm not kidding. I think this is a way underreported and underrepresented story. People do not have friends. And it's like this, I'll be honest, it's pissing me off. I was on TikTok last night. Now, if you heard my interview with Jeff Meyer last night, and this is also after the show, last week I tried to get on TikTok. I did get on TikTok. I signed up for TikTok because I'm trying to figure out if I want to put our show on there. And I don't know. So I used to work for Jeff Meyer. I was the editor-in-chief of Kong News. And about 2-3 years ago, Jeff says, well, Jim, get on that TikTok thing, see if we can use that. And so I did. And I got to admit, I was appalled. I was absolutely appalled. I think it's the lamest goddamn shit on the planet. I really do. And so I get on last night, and I'm scrolling through the live feeds, and there's thousands of people broadcasting live on TikTok at any moment. I mean, you can't go through them. And I'm literally swiping through like 2 seconds at a time. And the terrible thing to me is that 90 to 95% of the people who are broadcasting live are basically young women under the age of 21. I think most of them are minors looking for attention. And I just think, okay, so this is when entertainment has come to in America. I don't know. I'm an old fogey, I guess. But yeah, I brought that up because, yeah, loneliness. We're messed up. That's the problem, okay? And I'm an old guy, and I admit it. I admit it. Now, another announcement I have here too. This is a really weird thing. We're not going to play any commercials tonight, and I'm sure thinking, "Oh wow, great, whoopee!" We've been having problems here because I have noticed, and it's been pointed out to me, that the audio from our commercials are not showing up on the feed, and I cannot figure out why. I mean, I've gone through this. You know, this is a pretty complex setup we have here. I know that I'm very proud of the fact that the show looks relatively good, especially to most of the other stuff online, and that's great. But still, we're playing commercials, and the audio isn't showing up in the feed, and I don't know why. So for the time being, we're just not going to play any commercials at all. And I bet you're thinking, yeah, that's great, that's terrific. Okay, so let's plow forward. Then we're going to put Nathan on here. Nathan Worcester is going to be joining us in like 15 seconds. Hey, Nathan, how you doing?
Hey, Jim, glad to be back.
Yeah, nice to have you back. And I was saying you dressed up and everything, and Zelensky didn't. And also, I didn't know this until you told me just before we went on. You're now based in Washington, D.C., You were previous in Chicago, right?
I was, yeah, born in Wisconsin, but raised and spent most of my life in Chicago. So I
May
can
I
tell
ask,
I have the accent, but I'm not sure I can't
may
talk.
I ask where in Wisconsin are you from, specific?
Suburbs of Milwaukee, so
Oh,
Brookfield mainly.
uh-huh. Is there a Wisconsin accent? I don't even know. I
I
probably
it's
can't
like
tell.
it's a milder version of the Minnesota accent. I think it's
Yeah.
kind of like this, but you just gotta kind of talk like that a lot and don't really say anything really, that sort of accent. I think
Well,
is
this is honest God truth. English is actually my second language. So I'm constantly people say, "We don't sound like a Minnesotan." No, I don't. But it's like that's just because I'm weird. So, uh, what was the move like to DC? How's this going?
well, I have to say, being on Capitol Hill, having the chance to actually see how the sausage is made, so to speak, it allows me to understand the American political system in a way that I could kind of get an idea of it. But it's been educational. It's been good to actually, talk to some of these people and really watch the process. In this case, of some of the talks between lawmakers ahead of the likely government funding deal. That's probably going to drop tomorrow, by the way, and reconciliation. Basically, watching Washington adapt or not adapt to the Trump reelection. I can tell you that this is a town with a lot of federal employees, and unsurprisingly, a lot of them are upset to be out of jobs or potentially out of jobs. So I think I might be the only person in DC who showed up in early November rather than preparing to leave.
Have you ever been fired before?
That's a good question. I've been laid off as part of a company just folding. It was a startup, and the closest I've ever come to being fired was a summer job. I don't want to get too specific about it, but
No,
in
I don't
all
want
honesty,
to.
I didn't do a very good job. And I asked, "Hey, can I continue in the fall?" And they said, "No, not really. You kind of goofed off a bit."
Well,
But
the reason I ask is because the problem, if you ask me, I've been fired at least a dozen times. I mean, I don't even want to get into that either. But people who work for the federal government have not been fired like ever. And if you worked in the private sector, which the vast majority of America does, and almost everybody during the career, if you live long enough, usually at least gets laid off, if not actually fired. And so, we look at these people and they're crying, "Oh my God, this is absolutely terrible." And I'm just sitting home, I'm laughing. It's like, oh my God. It's like, and not to mention the fact, my personal feeling, Nathan, is that you could cut 80% of the federal employees out and the thing would still run just fine. That's my personal feeling, but I don't know if that's true, but I have
well,
feelings.
you got to also pay attention to the media landscape, and unsurprisingly, the stories where people were fired who perhaps shouldn't have been fired, like those nuclear workers who were let go, that gets more attention than the cases where, yeah, there were perhaps, as in the case of Twitter, now X, a lot of people who weren't contributing a lot and who could be lost, especially with the advent of AI and new technologies. And one thing that John Hoeven, who's a senator who's been working somewhat with Musk along with others, told me is that they're actually promoting people based upon merit. This is what I've heard. I was saying it would be nice if some of those stories got out too, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that the government runs well at whatever scale. And if that means losing a lot of people, yeah, if that also means making sure that people who have merit aren't passed over or are able to actually deliver, that's the other side of the equation that people should keep in mind.
Well, the other side of the equation too, and you've been writing about Doge a lot recently in the Epoch Times, and that is, um, and no one is completely satisfied with any cuts. No, I mean, no, there's no way everybody can be happy here. I don't know if there's any way anyone can be happy. I mean, somebody's got to do something. And like you said, worthy people are going to be eliminated. There are people who are not worthy, who are not going to be eliminated. I mean, that's bound to happen, especially with a machine that's this big. So,
Yeah, that's going to be difficult to avoid. And another thing I was told by a member of Congress, this was Diana Harshbarger from Tennessee, was that at the end of the day, they can look over some of those programs, some of those names, and if they're actually useful, they can set them back up. And there's been a lot of interesting stuff happening on Doge or just cuts and things related to it. Notably, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of that USAID and State Department money being able to go forward. It was a very narrow 5-4 ruling, but that was a bit of a setback for the general push from the Trump administration on making some of these cuts and changes to government. At the same time, you had just, I believe, quite recently, Trump speaking to his cabinet secretaries and saying, you're the people who are going to be taking responsibility for cuts. You're working with Doge, but legally, Doge itself cannot fire people. They can make recommendations. They can, come up with these areas where they say there need to be cuts, there need to be savings, there need to be rationalizations, and even just technological changes. Because one big theme, and this is a big reason why Doge is in the U.S. Digital Service, is that there's a lot of technological backwardness in the government. Not too surprising, but you have databases that can't talk to each other. So that opens up the possibility, for example, of people being able to take advantage of one system, providing information that is not being checked by other systems, and using that to basically defraud, I would say, the taxpayer, but also the government. So that's really an important issue that I think is being lost out in some of the flash and filigree, the way that the media and the way that even a lot of Doge proponents talk about Doge, is that really there are radical inefficiencies on the technological side. I think the hope is that eventually, when the dust settles, a lot of those efficiencies, if not, and I think this is probably not going to happen because of the power of the federal employee unions and the way the system is set up, but if not an easier path to letting people go, then at least a greater degree of technological efficiency and maybe good people being promoted for the most part, and people who are not so good either being let go or ending up in a position where they're not able to do the sort of damage that they could do before.
You just told me something I did not know, and that is I did not know that Doge actually couldn't fire people. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's important to get into those granular details, some of those technical areas of what these particular entities have the power to do, what they have no power to do. And then you get into questions about responsibility for firings. So one of the big stories has been talk of perhaps 80,000 people being let go from the Veterans Administration.
Yeah.
And according to lawmakers, I didn't hear this confirmed from Musk himself, but these were lawmakers who spoke to reporters after meeting with Elon Musk in the House late last night. They believe that that was a result of the VA acting a little too rashly and not carefully enough, not applying the scalpel instead of and applying the cudgel instead when it comes to the VA. I know that the VA itself has, at least in the past, tried to shield, doctors, nurses, people who are not as easy to lose from being fired. But, one of the big developments I think we're going to have to look to is just to what extent are these agencies responsible or not responsible for acting in particular ways based upon what Doge does. Because at the end of the day, under the law, under the administrative system, and then of course under the power that Congress has or has traditionally wielded, Doge itself is an advisory body. It's one that's gotten a lot of press. It's one that has its X account where it posts big updates. And in fairness, some of those updates have contained errors, but they've also identified a lot of areas where even if they can't directly make the cuts, Americans are left scratching their heads, and especially in the cases where our soft power, things like USAID and these other elements of the state exerting its force overseas, when that's being used in ways that seem kind of strange and ideological. I'll give you an example that was brought up to me, for example, is in India, there has been USAID funding going to LGBTQ transitions clinics, and they've not just one, I believe multiple clinics have had to shut down. And of course, there's a hue and cry about that. And, leaving aside the value of that to individuals who would want to make that choice, why is American taxpayer money going to that? I think that's a very reasonable question to ask. And it's not,
especially in India.
It's not obvious to me what. I'll put it to you another way.
Alabama's one thing. India, I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that an average person, an average American taxpayer, looking at this question, which is a reasonable one, of how America can use its power overseas, if money is going to flow from the U.S. to other countries in some form or another, I think that's going to happen. going to like build a bridge in India, going to, purify water in Africa. I think people would find that a lot easier to justify than these moves and some of the policies that came out in the aftermath of the Afghanistan withdrawal, where it seemed like we were engaged in this effort at reshaping the society from the ground up and trying to impose these values that were radically at odds with those of the society that we were operating in. I think those are very different categories of things. And there's something to be said for, okay, these material things, if they're mutually advantageous, if they build up a good image of the US abroad in the form of direct real infrastructure, there's probably value to that, or at least you could argue the case. But unless you are really committed to certain ideologies and you think that the United States and its role on the world stage has to be the face of those ideologies, then it's hard to understand. And especially if the United States wants to be this credible voice and not undercut by other actors who say, hey, we're going to give you all the bridges, all the water purification, and none of the woke stuff. That's been argued to be the way that China operates. And then, countries get into debt traps with them. They end up in trouble. But, that's something that, whether or not you're someone who wants foreign aid to cease entirely, if you're someone who just thinks that foreign aid should be used more effectively, you look at these cases of things Doge has uncovered, and it's just, I think from a very sober, pragmatic standpoint, stepping back, it's hard to understand why a lot of the money that's been going in this direction has gone in this direction.
All I can say is no shit. Yeah, it is. It's really hard.
Jim Peters at night, so I guess you gotta throw in an expletive or two, right?
That's right. We're not on the radio, man. FCC doesn't apply here. But I'm going to throw out something just based on just what you just said, and you tell me whether you agree or not. And the problem with like Afghanistan and maybe some of the other Middle Eastern countries that we're sending this aid to is, it seems to me that a lot of people, I mean, I'm going to be blunt here, and people say I'm being callous, but a lot of people would say that a lot of these countries are basically like, in terms of civilization, like 200 years behind us, And so do we, I don't know, open question. Is it our job to pull them into the 21st century? I don't know. I don't know if it is.
That is a big question. And I think you can bracket that in a way, and you can get back to these matters of what is pragmatically useful. There can be questions, for example, about if you install infrastructure in a place where it is not maintained effectively over time, is that the smart thing to do? Or
is that even worth the trouble? Right. Is it just going to dissolve once we leave, or
is the relationship intended to be somewhat long-term and one of, to speak bluntly, patron-client? And there's an understanding that with smart infrastructure investments, that sort of thing, you're just going to have to eat the losses. I'm not saying that's the way to go, but that's at least something I could see an argument being made. This is bringing to mind going in a slightly different direction, but one that I think reflects the same very interesting approach the Trump administration has taken, one that seems to me extremely pragmatic, even if it ruffles a few feathers. The way that they are handling now this attempt to restore a ceasefire, the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel has expired, and this is broken very recently, they, in an unprecedented move, have had somebody speaking to Hamas. And this is one of those things where I think, there's a strong case to be made that, yes, Hamas has been designated a terrorist organization. I don't think we need to go through the litany of things that Hamas has done. But having an administration that says, okay, we are going to talk to these actors, we are going to try to get people to the table and end war, if that's in fact what they're doing and if that's what they accomplish, as compared to a lot of the kind of moralism that we've often seen from foreign policy, from so many different areas, it is refreshing. They still need to show results on this stuff, of course, but it is such an interesting change, and it just tracks with a lot of what we've seen, what we've heard. I mentioned the speech. The word that comes to mind is realism. Trying to approach the world as it really is, and if that's what they're doing, if that's what they're delivering on, I mean, in so many areas of American government, foreign policy, domestic policy, you name it, it's just it's such a difference from what we've been living with over the past few, I would say, decades and decades.
I would say that the fear that a lot of people have is that in communicating with these people, adversaries, terrorists, that I think that America in the past has had a tendency to basically capitulate to everything they want. In other words, people, it's like a lot of things, it's looked at as an all or nothing thing. We either don't talk to them or we talk to them and then basically give them everything we want. That's what I think people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And it looks like that's not the way it's playing out.
Yeah, I think stepping back, it seems like the most sensible thing in the world to be able to talk to people. That doesn't mean you agree with them. I
That's
mean,
right.
I'm
Yeah.
sure you don't agree with every last guest you've had on the show and every last topic.
No, no.
I don't know if you've had a Hamas member on. I mean, that would be an impressive guest. Maybe bring in Hezbollah or something to
Yeah,
just
well, I used to say I want to have Rachel Maddow on, but I kind of changed my mind.
Well, that's I don't know if I'd call her Hamas or Hezbollah, but it's funny. It's funny. It's funny. You should mention radicalism because again, speaking of what is and what isn't considered to be within the bounds of acceptable conversations or discourse. Just earlier this week, I had a chance to speak with a lawmaker who was there in connection with the sanctuary cities hearing that took place. And
Yeah.
one of the people who was there, who was rallying for the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, is a longtime Marxist-Leninist activist. And
No.
publicly known. I know, but it not a shock, but it's so. And I think he should certainly be free to say what he thinks and to promulgate his beliefs. But that doesn't seem to raise the sort of. It doesn't raise eyebrows in the way that Stephen Miller gets up there and says something and the world's heads explode.
Oh,
that
yeah.
does. And I think.
Yeah.
I think again, the word that I want to keep coming back to is realism and conversations. I think conversations wherever you stand on the issues of the day are good, but it's funny to see that sort of thing happen.
Were you actually at that hearing? Were you at that hearing?
This was at a subsequent press conference where he had come to rally the troops and was a very clear presence. I mean, it's very interesting. I've had on the ground conversations with.
Oh, you froze.
Left-wing peace activist types who've said that they're not. Oh, I froze. I've unfrozen. Am I good now?
No, you're good now. Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe I said the wrong thing. But when you have left-wing peace activist types I've spoken to, who there are aspects of Trump's calls for peace that they won't talk about it as publicly necessarily, but they're encouraged by that. And I think that's interesting to see. You're having people, I think, in this era, coming into alliances that they wouldn't have expected. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. becoming the Health and Human Services Secretary. You have Tulsi at DNI. It's a very new era in many ways, and it's like something like direct negotiations between the U.S. and Hamas. 10 years ago, that would have been a huge story, but there's just so many examples of new approaches that we're seeing every single day that it just gets lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, and so I've talked with other guests about this. Speaking of Kennedy and Gabbard, is the reason they got so much grief during their confirmation hearings was simply because they're former Democrats? Is that the bottom line here, or is that the people? I mean, I know a lot of people who don't like what Kennedy's been doing, or talking about. I do, but is the real bottom line is that they're traitors?
I think it's a conversation that I had. I think it was Mark Wayne Mullen, who's a senator from Oklahoma.
Yeah,
I was asking him about whether he would expect one particular nominee, a guy named Elbridge Colby, to get Democrats on his side, which after some conversations, I think when he's voted out of committee, that might actually happen. There's one senator from Michigan, Gary Peters, who I'm paying close attention to because unlike everybody else, virtually everybody else, at least on the Democratic side of the committee, he was not just asking Elbridge Colby to say that Russia started the Russia-Ukraine war. He was asking about things like, defense industrial capacity, which being from Michigan, he's got a vested interest in that. But, at Mark Wayne Mullen, the senator from Oklahoma, pointed out, if you couldn't get support for some of these other nominees, for some of these former Democrats who are certainly not far right or anything, I feel like that would be a very strange way to describe Robert F. Kennedy Jr., then who can you get support for? And, in fairness, you did have some interesting votes from people on previous somewhat controversial nominees, like Pam Bondi, for example, got a vote from John Fetterman. But then, of course, you also had Pete Hegseth, who came down to a tie in the Senate. McConnell and another senator, I believe, both defected, and J.D. Vance himself had to just, go back from wherever he was having, I think, a good time, and the people who might not like the idea of some of these former Democrats joining the Trump administration, voicing their opinions. You also have Republicans who are not, even if they're somewhat more circumspect about it at times, not on board the Trump train in every single way.
Right. Well, I know a lot of Republican friends who can't stand Trump's guts. I mean, that's where I live. This is one of the most liberal districts in America. I mean, even the Republicans here don't like him. It's really amazing. I do want to ask you though. You brought up Mitch McConnell. What's driving this guy? I don't quite get what he's got going on here. It's like, he's basically like, he seems to not be voting. Is he a rhino? I mean, I don't. Do you have any thoughts on this, or you picked up anything that I don't know, or it's like, can you read my mind?
Yeah, I don't want to speculate too much on anybody's motivations.
I know you don't. Yeah, I don't quite understand where he's coming from. Do you understand them? I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that he will be former Senator McConnell in not too many years. He's at the end of his career. I think maybe, and this is me just speculating, he anticipates somewhat of a reception if he votes in certain ways that John McCain, for example, got from the press and from lawmakers on the other side of the aisle during the Trump presidency. But that's just speculation. I would say that I don't have any special insights into McConnell, but I would say that I had some very interesting conversations today after Trump, during his joint address to Congress, was talking about wanting to get rid of the CHIPS and Science Act, which was this bill passed in 2022, all the money for semiconductor manufacturing. And one of the people who voted against it, Josh Hawley, he told me, and I'm paraphrasing here, the truth is,
he voted against it originally, or voted against killing it?
Hawley voted, so there's not been any formal effort to kill it in Congress. Okay. Hawley told me that in truth, there's not going to be anybody who votes against it. I spoke to another senator from a state that has benefited significantly of CHIPS, and he was saying, the CHIPS money, he hopes it will keep flowing, but that some other areas are addressed. I think that not to speak too bluntly here, but in Washington, if you've got something that's been passed and money is flowing to you, it can be hard, especially with something like CHIPS and Science, where you can make the case that there's a national security need here, and perhaps the way to address that would be not just giving grants to specific companies, but some sort of local content requirements, or some other trade measure. Trump likes the tariff, as we all know, but some other trade measure that would bring in semiconductor manufacturing to the U.S., which, not to beat a dead horse here, but in semiconductor manufacturing, as in so many other areas that the United States has outsourced, the fundamental science and engineering work took place here for the most part. We developed the semiconductor.
Right.
And so it seems, it's very strange to me that we've now ended up in the position where we can't produce this sort of stuff for ourselves. And apparently, it's being said that Americans are difficult to train in this area, which just for me, it kind of makes me raise an eyebrow. I mean, what sort of expectations are there for the sort of people who would do this work? Why? It just kind of, it boggles the mind, especially when you look at, PISA scores, the international assessment of students. A lot of American Asian Americans and others do quite well in those by international standards. So, the notion that Americans across the board are some sort of dumb, unteachable people, I don't think that's true. We still have the finest universities in the world, but for whatever reason, some of these areas where we developed it, we're being told that it's very difficult to bring it back to the U.S.
Nathan, I know that Trump wants to kill the CHIPS Act, but I've never heard anyone say why. Is it because he thinks that this area just doesn't need stimulus? Is that the reason?
So his explanation, and he has not provided too many details to the senators, from what I've been told. But the idea from him, and this is after he clinched $100 billion investment from TSMC in the U.S. It's the big Taiwanese chip maker, and they'd previously gotten 1.5 billion under chips, but he linked it to either tariffs or the threat of tariffs. Basically, you have the carrot and the stick, and I think it would be a little too generous to say that there aren't ways to play favorites with companies using tariffs or other protective measures, but I think it's fair to say that that's a very different enterprise from having grants or loans or other things that go out to specific actors. And the fear there from someone like Hawley or from other critics of the CHIPS Act is that it ends up basically picking winners and losers, or basically being a big slush fund going to big corporations. An interesting vote against the CHIPS Act was Bernie Sanders, who's known for his whatever else.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
He would think, I'd say he'd be a no-brainer for that. So what was his reason for voting against it? Do you know?
I don't know his reason, but again, we have his record as someone who I think says he's opposed to corporate welfare or just generally measures that would benefit large companies using taxpayer money. So it's very interesting to see. That's one area where the Republicans that I spoke to, they were all quite skeptical, and in the cases of a few, they were really making the case strongly for chips. And you look at the map, but a whole lot of states have gotten a whole lot of money from chips already.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. This is one of those things where you could make an argument that some good is coming from this. It's like, also, even when Biden proposed it and passed it, I thought, well, this is not terrible. I mean, I wasn't a big fan of his by any means, but I thought that was maybe, I don't know. Hey, and you kind of touched on this. What's your average day like? Like, how do you gather information? Do you actually go up to the Hill and hang around, or how does it work?
Yeah, that's much of what it is. They have hearings and they have votes periodically, and there are places on the Hill where you can reliably catch lawmakers and interview them. They also have offices and press secretaries, but everybody's quite busy, so you have to know about that. I mean, there's a million think tanks also. One funny detail is that the big conservative libertarian think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, is right across the street from the Brookings Institution, the big liberal think tank. It's funny, right? How they all sort of rub elbows in DC. It's one thing.
Yeah, well, that is kind of the deal, and it's all one. In some ways, it's all one big melting pot, and everybody just knows what sides they're on, and you just say hello across the street. Isn't that pretty much the way it works?
Well, maybe not. I think there's a lot of it's a comfortable town in many ways, and I think people shouldn't overlook the ways in which whatever the ideologies involved are, people enjoy their comfortable bubble here in DC. I try not to be seduced by the bubble of DC. But
I know that's obviously the reason so many people are traumatized by Trump, is because they don't want he could bust the bubble, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just give you a little flavor of DC. This is the only place where I've seen ads on the subway for military industrial complex companies. Raytheon advertising its latest technologies on the subway. Can you believe that?
No, I don't. That's unbelievable. It really is. I was just thinking about them the other day. I thought, God, what do they have to advertise for? I actually thought of this. Funny, you should bring it up. It's like,
yeah, you wonder, right? Just who the intended audience is, but certainly you get into DC and you can sense the ways in which it's a bit of a bubble. But I'm used to bubbles, and so don't want to get too comfortable in this one. But it's interesting, I should say, coming from a place like Chicago, where politics, having covered some Chicago politics, it is known as a place where there's a lot of wheeling and dealing, but also a lot of kind of hard pragmatism, which has been lost in recent years. You have, maybe this was taking place in the Daley era, but you had, when I was going to city council, a lot of people getting up and delivering their stump speeches against Trump, which, you wouldn't expect them to be fans of Trump, but it was not obvious how this was relevant to whatever, allocating money for street sweeping or something. It wasn't clear to me how those two things were connected. You got the nationalization of politics all across the board, from the left, from the right, from the center. So being in the place where the nationalization is taking place, it's I think a little easier
Hey,
to
were
get
you at the joint session Congress's speech? Were you there?
I was, yeah, I was able to get a few comments in Statuary Hall from different lawmakers. The funniest moment was probably when Bernie Sanders wandered. I should say he was not wandering because he's a fast man despite his age, but he came through and someone asked, "What did you think?" And he said, "My speech is going to be better," and then just bolted off down through the statues. And I didn't get too close, but I was there when Al Green, the congressman from Texas, was ejected. I was able to get a little bit of grainy video and heard the noise of all the reporters getting up and chasing after him. And I can tell you, the people in the Capitol do not like it when you chase lawmakers. There were a lot of stern comments, understandably stern comments after that happened. But Al Green was formally censured. That move did not go over well with Republicans, and I think even a lot of Democrats were not happy to see that because at a point now where they've suffered some pretty significant losses in 2024, and I think it's fair to say that they're relatively demoralized at the moment. Although they've got their they've got their issues that they're working on. Right now talking a lot about Trump's tax cuts and about their concerns about Doge. It doesn't, given the way that they are positioning themselves, where they had Alyssa Slotkin, who's this new senator from Michigan, seen as a very hawkish centrist person, delivering the rebuttal address to Trump. They seem to be trying to move away from the woke, to marginalize the progressives a bit. And the progressives are not too happy about that, I can tell you.
Yeah. But am I just like a naive SOB? It's like, how can the progressives think they must obviously know they're in the distinct minority in the country. And when you have to, you're talking about courting people and courting votes, it just seems like a lost cause to me. It's like you're never, I mean, they certainly haven't done a good job convincing people to vote for them, That's the part I don't get. It's like if you can't get people to vote for them, well, then you're losing and it doesn't matter anyway. But they seem to want to just plow forward with this. I mean, a lot of them want to double down on this whole thing, and I don't really get it. It seems suicidal to me. But and also, I was going to ask you the reason I brought that thing up whether you were there is speaking of them being demoralized. Wasn't there just generally their behavior during that speech just wasn't it just like the stupidest thing you could ever do? I don't understand. It's like they didn't applaud for anybody. They won't applaud for the little kid with cancer. They won't, it's like these obvious like emotional touchstones where you'd think that, all right, if I was running this, I would think, okay, you'd want some polite applause for positive things, but you don't. Basically, you want to be not like a nobody. But they took the opposite tack. They were like it's like they decided to basically kind of like repel everything, and it looked, from on the TV, it looked really, really bad.
Yeah,
And so
yeah. I mean, in the interest of fairness, there have been stunts by Republicans over the years in response to Democrats delivering that address. So it takes two to tango, but
yeah,
certainly not standing up for that kid. That's one that a lot of people have brought up that didn't look very good. Where I was sitting, one of the most striking moments was ahead of Green being ejected. Speaker Mike Johnson saying that the sergeant at arms would become active if things didn't change. And once Green was ejected, you notice the jeers really died down. There was a lot of stony silence. There were some boos, and as you said, moments when it seemed like it might have been the the smart political move, the appropriate move to stand up, especially in the more politically neutral areas like a kid with cancer. But the ejection of Green, I think that did echo through the chamber, so to speak. That did calm things down. I think we've all now seen not only the hand gesture from Trump when he was making the thing, but then behind him, Vance does the same. And I think that is an interesting symbol right now because despite the fact that Vance himself used to be a never Trumper and is somebody who I've certainly heard from people on the right, obviously from people on the left, but people on the right can be divided on him. But there does seem to be at the moment a great deal of unity between Vance and Trump, and Johnson himself, despite trouble, I think organizing all of his conference and this long, slow process of reconciliation to at least bring forward some of Trump's priorities, there does seem to be a fair degree of unity there that
Yeah.
was visually represented with them standing up and then maneuvering together in response to that disruption.
Forgive me for dwelling on this. I can't imagine that Green didn't think that was going to happen. I mean, I would just assume that was a deliberate thing, and he wanted to get thrown out, or he expected it to happen. And you're also right too. I mean, there was that thing when Barack Obama gave a State of the Union. I can't remember what Republican senator was that yelled out, "You're a liar." I know, believe it or not, those are the. I don't really pay. I don't think that stuff that's important. What's really important to me is how they acted as a body. You know, the fact that none of them, well, apparently, I guess one Republican congressman or Democratic congressman did stand up for the little kid, one out of what, 230 or something like that, you know. But that was actually the thing to me that I thought was actually more important, the fact that they acted en masse in such what I thought was an idiotic manner for them, you know, from their point of view. I don't see how they're winning any votes doing this. I mean, to me, they're just playing to a small minority of their own party, and I don't see why they keep doing it. I just don't.
Well, I was talking about the DC bubble, and you yourself mentioned coming from a very liberal district, and so these people like AOC and various others, they tend to be elected from districts where they're going to continue to be elected, and at least their base there in
Yeah.
a place like New York or Minneapolis or St. Paul or parts of the Pacific Northwest will respond to that. And there are incentives on the right too. If you're coming from a very red district, you can act differently from someone who wants his Kamani, a guy from a predominantly Hispanic border district that has previously been a stronghold for the Dems. These people in more competitive districts, they do have to act differently. And so as long as those bubbles exist, you're going to have a fair degree of ideology, I think, creeping into the public presentation.
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen here? Do you have any predictions just generally for the next year or so? Or do you see, is there something that's occurred to you that you see that you don't think other people see? Or,
Well, I mentioned the Hamas U.S. negotiations, and there's an obvious parallel there between that and the bilateral negotiations that have taken place between Russia and the U.S., which a lot of people, for similar reasons, they will tend to object to that. And as the Trump administration pointed out, they've had independent meetings with Ukraine numerous times. And Zelensky, after that situation that unfolded in the Oval Office, where I think, not to go off on a tangent here, but I think a lot of the news coverage did not adequately cover some of the provocative things that were said previously by Zelensky, even before that blowup. Zelensky suggesting that what Trump said about the condition of Ukraine might have come from Putin was a very clear dig. There were a whole succession of those things. And again, it takes two to tango. There was eventually Vance and Trump saying some rather inflammatory things to Zelensky, but it wasn't as though they just blew up at Zelensky for
right,
no reason whatsoever.
right.
There was a lot leading up to that moment.
And you're not getting off the tangent here, because I do want to talk about this. So tell me, I know that you're right about that there's stuff that previously that the public isn't really aware about that went on. I'm starting to think that that Zelensky is kind of like where Yasser Arafat was 25 years ago with Palestine, and that is Clinton came to the conclusion, dealing with Arafat, that Arafat didn't want to solve the problem because then Arafat would realize he was out of a job. And I'm starting to wonder if Zelensky's whole thing is that he's on the gravy train, or his country's on the gravy train, and he doesn't want the gravy train to end, and for that reason, he doesn't want to solve this problem. Do you think there's any truth to that he truly doesn't want peace? He wants to keep it going forever?
I don't know if it's that he doesn't want peace, but I think to take Zelensky's perspective for a moment, he, in the context of Ukraine, believe it or not, is someone who's seen as less anti-Russian than many of the opposition figures who could end up replacing him. But of course, the Trump team have been talking to some of those other politicians in Ukraine, I would say, applying a bit of pressure. I think it's fair to say that the decision not to hold elections, you can say that this is in line with the Declaration of
Hold it,
Martial
Nathan.
Law, and that it's
We
appropriate.
lost you there for a
Even
second.
then,
I
looking
think
at
what
the
you were
terms of
about to
that
say was
martial
very
law,
important. You were saying that the decision not to have elections.
was in line with the Declaration of Martial Law, the and I think you could make the case that this being not simply at war but invaded and in a position position where the eastern provinces, because they do have a large number of ethnically Russian speakers, that there's something that Russia could exploit. But at the same time, it's very hard to be able to do that and then hold yourself up as a paragon of liberal democracy. And then looking at the conditions of martial law, it is extremely brutal. You look through that list, and you do see a lot of things that are in our liberties, in our Bill of Rights, suspended explicitly, or seemingly off the table indefinitely. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's. I think that Zelensky himself is feeling the pressure. The fact that he came back to the table for this deal indicates that. And Russia is, I think, feeling the pressure as well because of their issues with manpower, bringing in North Koreans. You have the Europeans now talking about the need to rearm, the need to be able to fend for themselves militarily in a way that virtually all of them, with a few exceptions. I think we can always turn to Poland, for example, as a country that actually pulls its weight in NATO when it comes to defense spending. But the global chessboard, a lot of pieces are moving. I think one issue that remains to be seen is the extent to which these moves in Europe also involve an attempt to counter the CCP influence, because you do have countries there that have been more independent of NATO, but they've also cultivated relationships with China. And I think it's fair for the Trump administration to question, okay, if we're going to have relationships with you, is it to our mutual advantage for those to continue, for any sort of Belt and Road like structure to exist? And that's that's something that, to me, I'll want to pay attention to. I'll want to keep my eye on that. But of course, China's an actor alongside Russia, alongside Iran, alongside all these people. And I think that looking at the way that the moves so far, for the most part on the international stage, appear to have worked out in the aggregate, in the direction that the Trump administration has wanted. Not each individual one, but so far, at least at this very early stage, I think the trend has been positive, despite a lot of bad press, despite a lot of anger from the Europeans. We will have to see if we do, in a few years, find ourselves looking at a much more peaceful world. And if that's the case, the Trump team can claim a major victory. On the other hand, we could end up in a position where, if things go in a particular way, China exploits the window to invade Taiwan. We could, in theory, I suppose, have a situation where Russia feels as though it's been empowered to challenge another country's sovereignty. We could have numerous things unfolding, but you look at the overall picture. I think, especially, again, returning to that idea of realism, especially given the fact that it doesn't seem like the Trump administration is averse to talking to all actors. And it's I would say a reason to keep your eyes peeled and be hopeful that things will improve. I think that's true whoever the president is, but certainly with things changing the way that they are, both new opportunities and new risks are opening up. I think that's a neutral way of putting it.
You're going to think I'm changing the subject, but in a way I'm not. So tell me what you know about Britain. What's going on there? Because I look at some of the stuff, and it just seems, some of it seems downright appalling. I mean, you did actually touch on this a few minutes ago, indirectly, about the fact that it's worth pointing out that we are the only country in the world with an actual First Amendment that says we have freedom of speech. No other country actually does, which is the reason. So now in Britain, they're basically kind of shutting down what they consider quote unquote harmful speech, or divisive rhetoric, or whatever it is. But it just seems to me it's just a blatant control mechanism for the public, and it just seems completely, almost fascist. Are you following this? Or
that's one I'm familiar with the basic outlines. I haven't been following it too closely, but I did listen to the speech, the very succinct and forceful speech that J.D. Vance delivered in Munich, which is an absolute shot across the bow there. And I think coming back to that, hard power reality side of it, if the United States has this relationship with Europe, and Europe and the U.S.
all right,
share value, uphold the bargain to respect some of those values, it's going to be interesting to track if that actually results in anything. Certainly on the defense side, we've seen some changes. As far as I can tell, um, I, I I think that in the specific case, this is tied in with the speech, but in the specific case of a lot of these European countries moving to neutralize the more populist right elements in the form of, for example, the National Rally Party in France, and before that, Eric Zemmour was also a factor there. There's parties in Germany, AfD, Austria, I believe it's the Freedom Party there in the Netherlands and Sweden, all across the board. You have people responding to the same core sets of concerns, which would be mass immigration, economic stagnation, which is a very real and significant issue across Europe, and then related issues of foreign policy. That isn't always a factor for every party, but that's an important one. That's certainly with the United States making the moves it is in relation to Ukraine and Russia. It would seem that the world stage is opening up more opportunities for those parties, but again, we have to wait for more time to unfold. And are we going to get to the point where one of these parties that has been marginalized for the most part in the parliamentary systems of Europe actually has a seat at the table? Based upon vote totals, in many cases, they command a significant share of the population. AfD, I believe, finished second. And if you look at the number of seats that they've had in the German Bundestag, that's increased significantly just over the past 15 years. You have similar patterns in other countries with similar parties. With Nigel Farage's efforts in the UK, for example, I think it's reasonable to expect that it's been a massive factor in Labour being in power at all. I think that's hard to question. And so what it's going to come down to again is whether this rhetoric at Munich, whether some of the moves on foreign policy then translates to those parties having a seat at the table in a meaningful way. And it remains to be seen if that's going to happen. And if that is the case, then I could imagine some changes happening to some of these speech laws that many people on this side of the pond find so draconian and contrary, at least to the American ideals when it comes to free expression.
Yeah, well, you were talking about the economic situation in Europe, and I have economists on the show, and you could make an argument. And I hate to use the vernacular here. Well, actually, I don't. Fuck around and find out, because the thing is, it's like, if you're an economist, you could say, well, any jerk could have told them that this was going to happen. I mean, it's like, because you're right, they're completely stagnant at this point, and we aren't. And then, and so now we're kind of basically, well, I mean, I suppose you can make an argument we've been dominating them economically off and on for quite a while, but I mean, this is really, at this point, it's kind of a almost a dire situation for them. I mean, everything there monetarily is kind of ground to a halt.
Yeah, and I'll caution that I'm not an economist, but even just looking at, for example, where venture capital is, where some of these big startups occur, there's a reason there's so many talented Europeans working or seeking to work in the U.S. or other countries. People ending up in places like Dubai or Singapore, other countries where it's a bit easier to operate.
Right.
I think, and that's a danger that I think as Americans experiment economically. You don't want to make moves that would grind the economic machine to a halt. I think the long range effects of the tariffs, for example, remain to be seen, and viewing them not just as an economic policy, but as an attempt at reciprocity, leveling the playing field for free trade based upon equal trade, and also as a means of foreign policy leverage, attempting to maneuver Canada, Mexico, these other countries to ensure that they're not facilitating the flow of fentanyl or other issues that the Trump administration has named. That's one thing, but tariffs do impose costs on consumers. They do have knock-on effects that it should, I think, be kept in mind. Again, I'm not an economist, but it's going to be interesting to see. One thing I'd noticed that as we're watching the stocks move around, the first administration of Ronald Reagan also was marked by a recession during the first few years.
Right.
But the remainder of the 80s were, for the most part, pretty economically positive. We might not see the same situation here, and that was a slightly different dynamic. In that case, Paul Volcker was raising interest rates, and now Trump is attempting to apply pressure to bring down interest rates. And I think that the idea that he has is to make things like buying a home more affordable, which I should say, as a young person, it's definitely something I keep in mind, how unaffordable things like shelter have become. But
yeah, that's true.
There are a lot of moving pieces on the economic side that I would it'd be interesting to see just what, and I guess I'll return to it since I mentioned it at the start of the show, what the Scott Bessent vision that he outlined, the Treasury Secretary speaking at his very establishment Economic Club of New York, what that crystallizes as, because his speech, it really unfolded along the theme of Americans' economic prosperity, and that he said something to the effect of the American dream is not just about buying the cheapest goods. The American dream is about more than that. And so I think, it's incumbent on the administration, if they're making promises like this, and this could in fact happen, but it's incumbent on them to make sure that, after a few years, through things like changes in the interest rates and through the overall climate of economic growth being amplified, and certainly if there has been fuzziness in the numbers, and at this point it's been established that late in the Biden administration there was some questionable activity involving those economic numbers, but that real reliable indices of economic growth reflect growth. You would hope that all that is humming along, and that some of the disquiet in the markets with these tariffs and other measures settles down. But time, I think, will tell. We're still only not even the first 100 days in. We're around 40, we're probably at about 46 days, 40,
Yeah, something like
not
that.
even halfway 100 days.
Right. Right. All right. I got one last question here, and this is serious. I'm not trying to be funny here. What do you know, or do you hear anything about the UFO UAP situation?
Yeah, that's one that I've thought about, and I'm not a specialist. I was in DC when there were those very interesting drones or whatever they were appearing, and I guess that was eventually attributed to domestic cause. But one of the lawmakers I speak to fairly often is Tim Burchett. He's someone who's very
Yeah, he's really into it. Right.
He is. I haven't had a chance to speak to him about that issue, but it's one I'd like to delve into, because, I think, the term UFO, we attribute, extraterrestrial life to that term, but it literally just means unidentified flying object. As someone who has not delved into this deeply, I'm interested in the topic, but I'm agnostic, because I want to know more. But I think that at this stage, with the Tic Tac disclosures, with a lot of the scrutiny coming from when he was on the Intel committee, Marco Rubio, Burchett, who I mentioned, various others, and with what I hope remains an attitude aimed at disclosure from the administration, reflected in what is hopefully going to be a lot of information coming out on the JFK assassination and other events in American history that have raised a lot of questions. I'm hoping that in line with that, we start to get more disclosures. And in fact, if, as has been speculated, a lot of what we're seeing is domestic and the result of programs that the American public has not been made aware of, maybe there's a good national security case for that. But I think that at this stage, a lot of people are looking for answers. A lot of people are looking for better answers. I'll leave you with this before we close out. Being in DC, you do run into a lot of people who have classifications, who are operating in some way in the world of the military or intelligence. And one thing that I've heard repeatedly is that people have these areas where they're read in, have these areas where they know something, but it turns out that even though they can't disclose this information, whatever it is, a lot of it is kind of trivial stuff. A lot of it is
I'm sorry, I lost you there.
bullshit.
A lot of it, what
Sorry,
did you
sorry
say?
to swear, but
A
actually, I
lot of
shouldn't be
it is
swearing.
what?
Yeah,
A lot of it is
a lot of the stuff that gets classified is just trivial bullshit. A lot of it is
yeah,
trivial
I know
bullshit,
that.
and
Right,
people like classification in part because it allows them to have power. It allows
right.
them to feel important, and it allows them to have their little fiefdom where nobody else can challenge their knowledge of a particular thing. And there's a case to be made, and I think for some areas where yes, there's national security, other issues, what have you. But I think a lot of Americans, especially when you have these persistent questions about unidentified aerial phenomena, about all these issues, a lot of Americans would appreciate some straight talk from their government, and I would count myself among them. Whatever the answers are, I think we're at the stage now where we can no longer simply dismiss things as silly conspiracy theories or just entirely fabrications from whole cloth. Um, that being said, I would hope also that some of the explanations proffered are not themselves an effort to either discredit inquiry in this area or an effort to just seed a lot of nonsense, which I think anytime you stray into this territory, you're going to have people who are knowingly or not seeding nonsense. And that's one reason why I try to be agnostic and I try to be careful, is because, you really want to make sure that what you're saying is something disclosed by somebody that you find reliable, and that you can to the extent that you can verify it with your own two eyes, you've done so. Um, I'm certainly hopeful that we'll learn more on that and many other things. I'm curious, what are your thoughts? If you had a chance to speak to any investigators in this area, and do you
Oh,
feel like we're coming closer to knowing?
about half of the show is devoted to the UFO UAP situation, and better or worse, I guess I consider myself an expert. So, I mean, I have a lot of people on here. Jazz Shaw, who used to write, he passed away in October, unfortunately, suddenly. He used to write for, wrote for Salem Media, and he was basically the UFO guy for them, and he was connected to the Pentagon. So I actually heard a lot of inside stuff from him, both on the air and off the air. And so it was like the general, and there's a documentary coming out next week, if I'm right, about this guy. He interviewed 34 government and military personnel, and he said, the guy's name is Dan Fahar, if I'm right. And this is basically what Jazz said too, and that is, it's essentially an open secret that the non-human intelligence is coming to Earth. So that's basically where I'm at too, and that's it's easy to laugh about this sort of thing. And I know it was a serious question when I asked you, and I know you've been talking to Burchett about other things. I knew that, and he's basically kind of leading the charge in Congress in this. Him and, believe it or not, Chuck Schumer of all people. So it's kind of, people say it's not really like Schumer's personality to pick up the ball on this, but he is. So whatever.
That's encouraging. I mean, I think it shouldn't be, certainly, like this, that there are many issues that I think ideally would not be partisan, but this one in particular, I think, to the Democrats' credit, historically, they've been forcing disclosure in areas like if not this, then, through the Church Commission and similar inquiries. And I would say, the attitude should be, to the extent possible, to the extent that it's wise, in favor of disclosure. And certainly when you have, I think, like, as you said, what appears to be an open secret, one of my questions is, when we talk about non-human intelligence, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but I've heard speculation that it could be extraterrestrial or interdimensional, or that it could be something that is a fundamentally spiritual phenomenon. We haven't I'm curious, which or do you think it's all the above? Where do you seem to believe it?
Jazz Shaw brought this up regularly. If you listen to David Grush, the guy who testified before Congress, he's very careful not to use the word extraterrestrial. And so, yeah, because the thing is, there's a line of thinking or a line of evidence that this is not people coming here from other planets. They're coming here from like other dimensional places. So, and also, from what I understand, there's people in Congress who don't want to talk about that because they think that's literally over the head of the public, that the public literally can't grasp it. So they just soon avoid it altogether. And I believe, I understand that. I actually do. It's a pretty hard thing to wrap your mind around. Well, okay, so they're not coming from other places. They're coming from some other, like where? And then you got to explain that to the public. Well, how do you do that? And then Nick Pope, the guy who used to run the UFO desk for the UK Ministry of Defense, he said, I was all for disclosure until COVID. And then I realized, well, the public can't even handle COVID. How can they handle this? And I don't know. It's amazing. I talk about this regularly, but I don't know if the public can handle it either. I really don't know. So here I am.
I feel like, I have friends, and I've spoken to people who feel as though the public needs a lot of noble lies on stuff. I don't. I think that especially Americans are, they're an intelligent, but they're also like kind of a hard-headed, resilient people. And I think treating them like children, it's not good. It's not moral, but I think it's also not practical. We're not a servile population by nature. We're a population of people who founded themselves in freedom, and that comes with responsibility. There's some people who might not be able to wrap their heads around but that because they hold such and such a classification, they alone should be entitled to this information.
But Nathan, the conundrum here is that I might think that about the American people too, but if you release this information to the American public, you release it to the world, and maybe we can handle it. But getting back to like what I was talking about, there's countries in the Middle East that are 200 years behind us. Can they handle it? Are they going to be jumping off of buildings? I don't know. I really don't. It's a
yeah. Well, we should end in a minute, but I do, when you mention that, I'm sure you're familiar if you've read Richard Feynman or just run into the expression about cargo cults, where years and years after American planes and service members had left these islands, I believe it was in the Indian Ocean, maybe in or around New Guinea, you had tribes that were still reenacting as this kind of spiritual practice the planes landing. They'd have people throwing up fake fake objects meant to replicate the runway, and I think that ultimately, whatever the information is, people will end up rationalizing it, making sense of it within terms that they can handle. And there's been much crazier stuff that's happened. I would say, just even going from, maybe it's a different kind of thing in some ways, but I think even just the experience in the 19th and 20th century of going from, canals and early steamships, and then up to planes, and then to being able to go into outer space and just explore a lot of the limits of the material reality that exists. That alone was that alone unlocked a lot, and was probably pretty difficult for people to make sense of. But ultimately, people did, and people do, and maybe they might not get the full story. Maybe they'll have to rationalize it within some other framework. But I don't know. I think people can handle a surprising amount, is what I'd say.
I hope you're right. I truly do. Thanks for talking to us, man. Always a pleasure. This is great. This is terrific. When I come up, next time I come to DC, we'll have to go to Kincaid's and have a drink or something. I'd like that.
Yeah,
hey, by the way, speaking of this, so I had Mark Tapscott on a couple of weeks ago. So do you see him? I mean, do you guys?
Oh, absolutely. He's a legend in DC journalism. He's in the office fairly often, and I was talking to him just a few hours ago. So he's a presence. He's definitely someone who I look to as journalist who's been at it for a long time and is really quite good at what he does.
Yeah, you tell him I said hello, okay?
I will.
Appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again. So we'll see you soon. I'll put a link up on our blog to your author page on Epoch Times. So although I don't know, do you have to be I'm a subscriber. Do you have to be a subscriber to see that? I don't even know. I'll find out.
I think to see the author page, you can get on that. Don't have to be a subscriber.
Okay.
And
all right.
They do. I think they run promotions from time to time where you can get articles even if you're not a subscriber. So definitely look out for that. And I'll tell you this: that if I manage to speak to Tim for any length of time, and he does go by Tim rather than Congressman, I will definitely. And if there are additional hearings, I'm hoping to keep my ear to the ground on that. I'll just leave you with a little, because we're talking about Burchett, a little anecdote from today, which is I was walking through the Capitol and I see ahead of me about 30 feet, Tim Burchett walking past some security guards, and they have some interaction, and the security guards are just doubled over laughing. And I go up and like, that is a funny dude. And that's one of the best things about Tim Burchett, just as a person, leaving aside politics, disclosure, everything. He is one of the funniest people in Congress, and everybody loves him. He's got the reporters cracking up. He's got the security guards cracking up. He always calls me dude. So hopefully one of these days I'm not just dude. I'm Nathan to Tim Burchett.
Well, I'll call you dude. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Nathan. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
You take care. We'll see you soon. Okay. That's Nathan Worcester from the Epoch Times. Great guy. Terrific. Great conversation, too. Very knowledgeable. Yeah, him and Mark Tapscott, I'm sure, make a great tag team. I actually forgot to ask them where their office is. I don't know if they have an office in like the executive office building or K Street or wherever it is. But yeah, so, and I've said this before, too, and I truly mean this. There's only, as far as my opinion, which is what the show's kind of about, there's only two newspapers in America anymore actually worth paying for: the Wall Street Journal and the Epoch Times. And people tell you, if you look on the Wikipedia will tell you that the Epoch Times is a far right news organization. That's bullshit. It is not. I'll tell you what they're far right about. They were started by a bunch of anti-communists. The Epoch Times was started by a bunch of Chinese expatriates who hate the Chinese Communist Party, and they started this newspaper. And my parents both escaped from communism, so I hate the Communist Party too. So I have no problem with that at all. So if you want to call that far right, go be it. Otherwise, as you saw this here, talking to Nathan, and we've talked to Mark Tapscott before. I think we had a couple other people. Oh yeah, we have Nathan Wu on, and he's a Chinese expert too from the Epoch Times. We've had other people on from the Epoch Times on here too. It's really, really stellar journalism. And I really admire Nathan too so much because, and he touched on this about the fact that he is able to kind of weave his own, I don't know, I hate to use the term opinion, but I am going to, at least his own thoughts and views on stuff into objective reporting. It's still objective reporting, so I don't know. Give me a call here. Oh, hold on. Don't give me a call yet. Yeah, so we're going to take your calls here at 325-225-5546. And
ready to connect. Click connect to show now. You are connected as the host.
Did you hear that? No, you
Welcome,
didn't, did you?
Host.
That's actually
you are
one
now
of the
in
problems.
the host room and can manage your
that we're
callers
having
from the
here.
call-in studio web interface.
Anyway, yeah, give me a call, 325-CALL-JIM, 325-225-5546. You can also send me a text message at 408-458-5088. We're in the process of trying to consolidate all the chat feeds on all our different services that we broadcast to. And because I'm getting flack about the fact that I do not read them and I do not participate. And I don't, because right now there's like 6 of them. So which one do I do? But I think we're in the process of being able to consolidate them all into one feed. And if we do that, then I'm on, and I'll talk to you. And besides, there's an audio component to the show, and always has been, because I'm kind of a radio person. So I do want you to call in to talk to me. So I got a couple things here today before, if you don't call in. So I promoted this last night, and I never got around to talking about it. They have finally definitively figured out who Jack the Ripper was. And they did this through DNA. And believe it or not, so the DNA is like 140 years old. But up until recently, you couldn't do this with DNA that old or that scant. But one of the victims of Jack the Ripper had a scarf with the Ripper's DNA on it, and some investigator, I can't remember the guy's name, bought the scarf and had it tested, and they have come to the conclusion that Jack the Ripper was a 23-year-old guy named Aaron Kosminski, who was a barber in London at that time. And it kind of comes down to Sweeney Todd, almost, the barber of Fleet Street. But that's not, I don't know if Kosminski worked on Fleet Street or not. I don't know. But the thing is, Kosminski has always been one of the major suspects. So believe it or not, that after 140 years, that's been laid to rest. We know who Jack the Ripper was now. So, and then on top of that, speaking of DNA, they're trying to a bunch of scientists are trying to bring back the dodo bird, which was a real thing. People said, and the dodo bird looked really funny, and a lot of people thought it was a cartoon or something like that. No, the dodo bird was a real thing, and I can't remember when. I think the dodo bird went extinct around the turn of the 20th century, or about 120 years ago, I think. So they're trying to use DNA to bring the dodo bird back. There's also scientists, and I'm pulling this out of my butt. This is not a recent story. There's also scientists who are trying to bring the mastodon back, which was a relative of the elephant. And they were woolly creatures. They looked kind of sort of like elephants. They were about the same size, except they had long fur and they had longer tusks. But they're basically prehistoric animals. But apparently there's a lot of their DNA around all over the place, like poops and stuff like that. And you're going down to the La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles, and they got stuck there. And so there are people trying to bring that back too. I don't know if we're going to end up with Jurassic Park. I don't. I really don't. And I don't know if that's a good idea. And I'm not because of what happened in the movie. That's a movie. But we are going to have the opportunities shortly, if not right now, to be able to basically rebirth any animal that's extinct as long as we have some DNA. And there's DNA about something almost everywhere. So that's what's going on. That's going on now. Because once again, I'm a 12-year-old. I'm 12 years old inside my tiny little soul. So this woman, and this is also in the UK. There's a woman who was born. She's born without a vagina, which is not a common. It's a rare occurrence, but it does exist. There's a name for this malady. I can't remember what it's called. I mean, it's not unprecedented, in other words, but it's rare. And so she was born without a vagina, and she got pregnant. And so the theory is, and I'm not kidding you, this is what the theory is. The theory is that she was giving. It's a very unusual situation. She was having sex. She was giving oral sex to a guy who stabbed her, and the theory is that some of his sperm ended up in one of those stab wound openings and somehow made its way down to her uterus, and she got pregnant. So, in the past, people that this happened to, which is very, very rare, or sometimes it's been done by artificial insemination, they give birth through cesarean section, which is, because they have no vaginal opening. But no one's ever gotten pregnant like this before that anybody knows. So and apparently that's what happened. She literally got stabbed by a guy she was giving oral sex to, which sounds really pleasant. But and that's the theory, that's how she got pregnant. Okie dokie. And finally, Google is rolling out a search engine that was basically just an AI bot. So in other words, you would search Google and you would not get a list of links anymore to anything you queried or anything like that. You would simply get answers to your questions. And that's what I'm doing on Copilot and what people are doing on ChatGPT already. I don't understand. The problem, though, is, and you stop and think about this, there are websites that are already complaining about this. Without the links from Google, they don't get any traffic. And yeah, it could grind web traffic to a halt, and that's not necessarily a good thing now, but my problem is I've been in the web business for 35 years now. I mean, I was in the web business before people knew what the web was. And my problem with this is I think that if you're relying on Google for your traffic, you're nuts. I've always thought this because they can change the algorithm at a whim. They could go bankrupt. Who knows? If you're actually relying on Google, you should not be doing that. And of course, that makes your job a lot harder. And so what? Your job is hard. Whose job isn't hard? Yeah, that's all I got. So if you're not going to call, I think we're done. I think that's it. It's over. Now, tomorrow night, Lee Richardson is going to be here. She's a psychologist and she's a founder of the Brains Performance Center in Dallas. And we're going to be talking about sports gambling addiction and loneliness and a whole bunch of other stuff. She's been on the show before. It's been about a year, I think. But yeah, she's been here. I specifically wanted to talk to her about those subjects. Because she's an expert on them. And I do wonder about a lot of men are blowing a lot of money that they're never going to see ever again. So, and I find that kind of fascinating. It's not my money, but still. And Monday, I tell you what, here's the deal. We don't have any guest booked list so far for next week. So I don't know what's going to happen. I have a new policy here. We're not doing shows unless we have guests. So, and I think I might automatically bail on Monday anyway, because I'm thinking about going to see my 100-year-old mother who's recovering from her pelvic accident. She busted her pelvis. So I think I'll go see her on Monday. It's supposed to be a wonderful day here today. Okay, so today's Thursday. On Tuesday night, we got a foot of snow here, and it's already almost gone. Spring has started here in Minnesota early. It started early, actually. Usually this doesn't happen till like the second or third week in March, but it started last week. And so we've had temperatures above freezing, and not only that, even into the 50s. So I got to drive a little bit to see my mom, and the weather on Monday is supposed to be very nice. So I think we're just going to bail on Monday altogether. But hopefully I will arrange for some guests here in the next. You don't want to know about my problems, you don't, but I'm going to tell you anyway. The problem with running a show like this is it's very labor intensive because we have to book guests, and the thing, we have no idea when people can come on, even if they agree to come on, if they agree to come on at all. It's like, it's a shotgun method. We send about a whole bunch of emails to a whole bunch of different people. Literally have a list of literally hundreds of people that would make potential guests for the show. And we send emails out, and hopefully we get an answer back, and hopefully then we can negotiate a day and all that sort of stuff. So that's the problem. Now we have a new producer here, Stephen Sullivan. He has just started working on the show, and his primary job is booking guests. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping that I can have him join me on air here one night a week. That's what I'm hoping. I've talked to him about that. He wants to do it. It's a matter of arranging for it. We bought him some equipment to broadcast from his house. So I'm hoping that it's going to happen soon. But he's basically just starting just now. So hopefully we'll see the results of that in a short time, which would be more guests, which means more shows. So yeah, that's my problem. That and the fact that my hair is not falling out. I was listening to Joe Pags I was driving around this afternoon. Joe Pags show, very entertaining guy on the radio, and he was talking about the fact that if you know Trump at all, Trump has a thing about hair, and not only his own hair, everybody else's hair too. He apparently hair is a big deal, and I'm thinking I'm getting older here, but I'm very fortunate because my hair is not falling out at all. It just seems to be wired in. Doesn't fall out, not the least bit. So, matter of fact, the problem I have here, if anything, and I've said that my friends have commented on this, and that is my hair. It almost looks fake sometimes, and it isn't. I want to tell you, this is all real right here. It's all real. Yeah. I mean, it's turning gray, but it's not falling out. So I don't know. Whatever. I'm just a guy on the inner tube entertaining himself. But that's our show for tonight, folks. I tell you what, we're done. So anyway, good night, Esperanza. Good night, Uncle Donnie, and good night to you wherever you are. We'll see you tomorrow night with Lee Richardson. Take care, everybody. Have a nice evening.